However, there are at least a handful of folks up on the Supreme Court who have been willing to either ignore or contradict the express terms of the Constitution in favor of Donald Trump at least a couple of times, and it's the radical right-wing bloc of the Supreme Court. But I'll tell you, Brian, the first really substantive challenge to Donald Trump's policies that the Supreme Court has grabbed hold of, and it had to do with whether the U.S. aid contracts that Donald Trump's executive branch was defaulting on, they weren't paying for services rendered because he just said, yeah, you know what, U.S. aid, that organization, that government agency isn't a thing anymore. The Supreme Court said, you know what, it is a thing and you will make good on $2 billion of money you owe to U.S. aid contractors. There were two crossover votes there. Chief Justice John Roberts, who often votes with the right-wing bloc, and Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Let's hope, Brian, that is a sign of things to come when this Supreme Court, decides other issues, other cases regarding what the Constitution says and whether it means what it says.
Glenn, moving forward with this thought exercise for a little bit, birthright citizenship is quite literally prescribed in the Constitution in black and white. You could not have a clearer indication of something that is unconstitutional as you have in Trump's executive order trying to end it. And so in the event that we do have somebody like Samuel Alito or Clarence Thomas align themselves with the Trump team on this issue, what would it say that a Supreme Court whose job it is to properly interpret the Constitution opts instead to just completely ignore what it says, the plain text in black and white, in deference to their political ideology?
It would say, Brian, that if the legitimacy of the Supreme Court was hanging by a thread, Alito, Thomas, and any other justice who decided to write birthright citizenship out of the Constitution ruled that, we don't care what the Constitution says. That would be like, Alito or Thomas just kind of reaching up with a pair of scissors and snipping that thread that was still holding on the last vestiges of Supreme Court legitimacy. I have to tell you, Brian, I am not often confident that a Supreme Court case will come out a particular way, like a pro-democracy way that is loyal to the language of the Constitution. I have a feeling, particularly given what just happened with Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett crossing over and joining what we call the liberal bloc of the court previously, just last week, I think they're going to hold strong. And I think they're going to be more inclined to hold strong each time Donald Trump defies a court order, because the Supreme Court understands if they embolden him by ruling his way while he is resisting complying with federal court orders, they are basically writing their own obituary, figuratively speaking, as an institution of government, as a co-equal branch, the judiciary. So I am a little bit more bullish these days on what we might see moving forward coming out of the Supreme Court.
I agree with you, and I am bullish, too, that as far as this case is concerned, that there isn't much to worry about. Of course, I can be proven wrong, and you and I have been proven wrong in the past, but I am bullish on this case. And so given the fact that this does seem like such a fool's errand, what's the upside for Trump in terms of pushing this thing all the way to the end, knowing full well that A, their resources are limited, and B, they're likely just headed for defeat anyway? Why proceed in this manner?
It is the cruelty, it is the fear, it is the intimidation that he's trying to instill not only in folks who enjoy birthright citizenship, but other immigrants who might be considering coming to the United States. Because, this is just one issue, birthright citizenship, but it is part of a larger corrupt scheme by Donald Trump to ignore the law, ignore the Constitution, and do everything he can to hurt immigrants, not just enforce the laws of our nation such that when people come here unlawfully, there is a process in place to hold them accountable for that. It is to instill fear and intimidation and hopefully deter others from trying to come here and live the American dream.
Glenn, given the fact that the appeals court pushed back today, what are we looking at in terms of the timing more broadly? Is this going to be a quick process? Are we looking at months or years?
I have a feeling, this would be my strong hunch, that because we've got two federal circuit courts of appeal who have said, yeah, this is blatantly unconstitutional. And let me add, parenthetically, Brian, that the very first judge to rule that this was, quote, blatantly unconstitutional, that's the language this judge used, was a judge out in Seattle who's been on the bench more than 40 years and was appointed by whom? President Ronald Reagan. So I don't think anybody can accuse this judge of being a raging Democrat. So I have a feeling what Trump will now do is, even though he has lost hands down in all cases where this issue has been decided by judges, he's going to try to get that preliminary issue up before the Supreme Court. I have a feeling he will lose spectacularly, and at least that will be one front on which, the Supreme Court will have spoken. Birthright citizenship revocation will be off the table, assuming Donald Trump will comply with orders and rulings of the Supreme Court, and then Donald Trump will move on to his next outrage against immigrants.
Glenn, usually when the Supreme Court takes up an issue, it's because we saw a circuit split. So, for example, one circuit agreed with the plaintiffs and another circuit disagreed with the plaintiffs. And so you need the Supreme Court to step in and be the arbiter here, be the decider, because you don't want different rulings applying to different jurisdictions. This is an instance where, as you mentioned, we have a court in New England and a court in California, both of whom have decided the exact same way. And so is it even necessary for the Supreme Court to step in, given the fact that far from a circuit split, we actually have unanimity among two different circuit courts?
Yeah, no, I'm actually going to bet 75 cents of my max $1 bet on the Supreme Court refusing to take this issue up, rejecting review of this issue and saying, hey, circuit courts and federal trial courts across the country, keep on litigating, because there is no dispute or split among federal court judges or courts of appeal that we have to decide. But now we've given people some points of light, and we're going to take a little bit back. Because remember the presidential immunity case, there was no split. Indeed, that we had the trial court, Judge Chutkan, saying, no, presidents aren't absolutely immune from their crimes. We had the appeals court judges unanimously saying, no, a president is not absolutely immune from his crimes. Now, there were no cases in other circuits, but all of the judges basically unanimously said there's no such thing as presidential absolute immunity. Supreme Court didn't care. They took it on review, and they created out of whole cloth the doctrine of absolute presidential immunity, which in a very real sense, and I'll end with this, Brian, I always quote what constitutional scholar and professor up at Yale, Akhil Reed Amar, said about that presidential immunity ruling. The Supreme Court in that case ruled that the Constitution is unconstitutional. This is something that we're going to have to fix somehow, some way moving forward.
And finally, Glenn, let's finish off with this. We've spoken about the legal perspective, but on the political front, what do you think the benefit for them in pushing ahead with this is going to be, given the fact that, again, it's so futile?
Brian, that's a great question, and I am entirely ill-equipped to answer questions about the political front, but you're the political expert. So what do you think it means for the Republican Party moving forward that Donald Trump keeps going on these snipe hunts trying to, undo constitutional guarantees?
Well, look, I think that we know full well the Republican strategy of flooding the zone, and they want us talking about 10 different things. They want us talking about healthcare and abortion rights and unions and the wage and climate change and attacks on birthright citizenship, knowing that even if it's a futile exercise, legally speaking, that if it dilutes the narrative, because we have 10 people running in this direction, 10 people running in this direction, 10 in this direction, 10 in this direction, 10 in this direction, then really nothing sticks. And so, for example, if Republicans are able to pick off 10 or 20% of people who would normally be talking about the main issue today, which is, yet again, we have Republicans attacking, taking from the have-nots and giving it to the haves, taking resources away from folks who rely on Medicaid, who rely on food stamps, who rely on education funding, and making sure that Elon Musk and his buddies can get fat government contracts and tax breaks that are overwhelmingly going to benefit millionaires and billionaires, then that helps the Republican Party more broadly. And so, like I said, even though there's very little likelihood that anything here is going to succeed, if they can continue attacking on all fronts and really continue to spread Democrats thin in terms of what we're talking about.